The black card was declined once. Ethan smiled like it was a mistake. Try it again. The cashier did. Declined. This time, nobody said anything. Vanessa stared at the card in her hand. Ethan's smile disappeared just enough for people to notice. Around them, conversations kept going, but not one person seemed to be listening anymore. Then I looked across the ballroom. Monique wasn't watching them. She was calmly thanking a children's charity director for coming, as if she had expected this exact moment all along. And somehow, that frightened me more than the declined card ever could. Before I tell you why, let me quickly welcome you. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. People who met Ethan and Monique Carter after the company became successful usually assumed they had always lived that way. The polished office, the respected reputation, the invitations to charity galas, where everyone seemed to know Ethan before he introduced himself. They never saw the version that came first, the version with stained carpet, mismatched office chairs bought from a closing insurance agency, and an aging laptop that sounded like it was arguing with itself every time it started up. Back then, there wasn't much to impress anyone. Just two people trying to convince Atlanta to trust them with events they barely knew how they were going to pull off. Ethan had a gift that couldn't be taught. He made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. A conversation over coffee somehow became a future meeting. A hesitant business owner walked away believing an event they couldn't afford might actually be possible. Donors liked him because he made generosity feel exciting instead of expected. Monique used to watch him work from the other side of the room with quiet admiration. "You make people believe," she once told him, after they landed a fundraiser everyone else had turned down. He smiled, slipped an arm around her shoulders, and answered without thinking, "Only because you're the reason I know we can actually deliver." That was how they worked. He opened doors. She made sure they never had to apologize after walking through them. While Ethan met clients, Monique stayed behind negotiating vendor contracts line by line, catching hidden fees, checking insurance requirements, comparing delivery schedules, and building spreadsheets that almost nobody else would ever appreciate. She liked that part, not because it was glamorous, because it mattered. If a florist canceled the night before an event, Monique already had two backups. If a donor changed seating arrangements an hour before dinner, she'd already printed an extra set of place cards. If rain threatened an outdoor fundraiser, she'd quietly rented tents 2 days earlier without mentioning it, unless someone asked. Problems rarely became emergencies because she believed preparation was kinder than panic. Their first few years weren't easy. There were months when they delayed paying themselves so employees could receive full salaries. There were evenings when dinner came from a drive-thru because neither of them had enough energy to cook. Sometimes they celebrated landing a new client by sharing one slice of cheesecake instead of buying two. Neither of them complained. They were building something together. That was enough. Late one evening, after finishing another fundraising proposal, Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked around the tiny office. "You ever think about what this place might look like in 10 years? Monique looked up from her laptop. "I mostly think about making rent next month." He laughed. "I married the only person capable of turning optimism into a budget. And I married the only man who thinks optimism counts as a financial strategy." "It has so far." "It has because I keep fixing your math." He grinned. "I was trying to sound romantic." "You failed." "I noticed." They both laughed harder than the joke deserved. The cleaning crew probably wondered why anyone stayed that late in an office that looked too small to become anything important. Neither Ethan nor Monique cared. Those nights became some of the memories she would later miss the most. Not because life was easier, because they still looked in the same direction. As the business slowly grew, people began recognizing Ethan more often. It made sense. He was the one speaking at community breakfasts, meeting corporate sponsors, and standing beside oversized donation checks for photographs. Monique preferred staying behind the scenes. If reporters asked to interview both founders, she'd usually find a reason to let Ethan handle it. "You should go," she'd tell him. "You tell the story better." He'd hesitate. "You sure?" She'd nod. "I'll survive 30 minutes without you." He always thanked her afterward. Sometimes he even joked that she'd saved him from answering questions about accounting because she'd fallen asleep explaining tax regulations once. She rolled her eyes every time. "You promised never to tell people that." "I promised nothing." It felt harmless then. Like the private language, every marriage develops. The company kept growing. Employees came aboard. Their client list expanded. The little office disappeared, replaced by a bright downtown space overlooking part of Midtown Atlanta. One Friday afternoon, after signing a contract with one of the largest nonprofit organizations they'd ever worked with, the staff surprised them with cupcakes and sparkling cider. One of the younger coordinators raised a plastic cup. "To Ethan," she said. "None of us would be here without your vision." Everyone applauded. Ethan smiled. Then he looked toward Monique. "Hold on," he said. "You should really be thanking my wife." The room turned toward her. "I make promises." He pointed across the conference table. "She's the reason we keep them." Monique felt heat rise to her face. "Oh, stop. I'm serious. You'll embarrass me. You earned it." The applause started again. She laughed awkwardly, wishing people would sit down before someone noticed how uncomfortable compliments made her. Later that evening, after everyone left, she bumped his shoulder while they loaded empty boxes into the recycling bin. "You didn't have to do that." "I did." "No. You think nobody notices what you do." "I don't need them to." "I know." He looked at her for a second longer. "But they should." She believed him. Years later, that conversation would come back to her at the strangest times, not because he'd lied, because somewhere along the way, he slowly stopped saying it. The company's 10th employee joked that Ethan had become impossible to take anywhere without someone stopping him. It wasn't entirely wrong. A breakfast meeting stretched into 2 hours because 3 different business owners wanted introductions. Lunches turned into networking sessions. Fundraisers became opportunities to meet city officials, foundation directors, and corporate sponsors who all seemed to know his name before he knew theirs. Monique never minded. That had always been Ethan's gift. She was genuinely proud of him. When magazine profiles started appearing in the lobby, she teased him by placing one beside the coffee machine. "So people don't accidentally forget what you look like." He laughed. "I was hoping you'd frame it. I was hoping it'd disappear before payroll on Friday." He folded the magazine and tucked it into his briefcase. "You keep pretending this stuff doesn't matter." "It doesn't. It brings clients." "Clients matter." He smiled. "You always edit my sentences." "Somebody has to." It was easy then. Comfortable. The kind of conversation built over years instead of weeks. As the company expanded, Monique spent more time building departments than attending events. She interviewed operations managers, redesigned internal approval systems, negotiated insurance renewals, and created procedures that allowed the business to grow without becoming chaotic. Most people never noticed those changes. They noticed the packed gala, the smiling guests, the successful fundraising totals. They rarely thought about the hundreds of quiet decisions that made those moments possible. Monique preferred it that way. Recognition had never been her goal. She measured success differently. Employees staying with the company for years. Donors returning because every promise had been kept. Charities calling back because they trusted the team completely. That mattered more than applause. One afternoon, Ethan was preparing for an interview with a local business magazine. The photographer adjusted the lighting while the reporter reviewed notes. Monique stepped into the conference room to drop off a revised sponsorship agreement. "Oh, perfect," the reporter said. "You must be Mrs. Carter." Monique smiled. "I am." The reporter looked toward Ethan. "So she helps out with the company too?" Before Monique could answer, Ethan spoke. "She runs operations." It wasn't wrong. She did. The interview continued without interruption. A few minutes later, Monique left the room carrying the empty coffee tray she'd come to collect. She told herself not to overthink it. The reporter didn't need her resume. The interview was about Ethan. Still, as she walked back to her office, she caught herself replaying the sentence. She runs operations. Simple, accurate, yet strangely smaller than it should have felt. That evening, Ethan found her reviewing vendor proposals. "You've been quiet." "I've been working." He leaned against her doorway. "You know what I mean." She looked up. "For the interview today." "What about it?" "You introduced me differently." He frowned, honestly confused. "Did I? You usually say I'm your wife, or your partner. I also said you run operations." "You do." "I know." He waited. "So, what's wrong?" She almost answered. Almost. Then her phone rang. One of their largest nonprofit clients had discovered an issue with a venue permit that needed immediate attention. Monique answered instinctively. By the time the call ended 20 minutes later, the conversation had dissolved on its own. Ethan had gone home. She stared at the empty doorway for a moment before shutting down her computer. Maybe it wasn't important. Maybe she'd misunderstood. Marriage, she believed, required choosing which things deserved a fight. That didn't. At least, that's what she convinced herself. The next few months passed faster than either of them expected. Awards, interviews, corporate partnerships, charity dinners. The company became one of Atlanta's most respected fundraising firms. People started recognizing Ethan in airports. Restaurant hosts occasionally offered him better tables. Young entrepreneurs asked for selfies after conferences. He handled it well. At first, whenever someone congratulated him alone, he'd usually say the same thing. "I couldn't have built this without Monique." He said it often enough that she stopped noticing, until the day he didn't. It happened at a luncheon hosted by a regional healthcare foundation. A board member shook Ethan's hand. "Incredible company you've built." "Thank you." The conversation kept moving. That was it. No correction. No mention of Monique standing 2 feet away discussing seating arrangements with another guest. She noticed. Not because she expected praise, because Ethan hadn't even seemed to realize anything had been left out. Driving home that evening, she glanced over from the passenger seat. "You were quiet today." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've been talking all afternoon." "You know what I mean." He smiled faintly. "I learned that line from you." She smiled back despite herself. Then she looked out the window. Street lights slid across the windshield one after another. She thought about bringing up the luncheon. Instead, she asked whether he'd remembered to confirm next week's catering contract. He had forgotten. They spent the rest of the drive solving the problem together. By the time they reached home, the conversation she'd wanted to have no longer seemed worth starting. That became their pattern. Whenever something felt slightly off, there was always something more urgent waiting. Neither of them noticed that every postponed conversation quietly made the next one harder. By their 7th year in business, people stopped asking whether Carter Events and Philanthropy would survive. The question became how much bigger it was going to get. The company was coordinating fundraising galas for hospitals, educational foundations, housing initiatives, and children's charities across Atlanta. Every successful event led to another introduction. Every fulfilled promise brought another recommendation. Growth had become expected. Monique never let herself think that way. She still checked contracts twice before signing them. She still called vendors personally, instead of assuming someone else had handled it. She still walked through empty ballrooms the night before major events, looking for details no one else thought to notice. An exit sign blocked by floral arrangements. A wheelchair access route narrowed by decorative tables. A power cable stretched where servers would be carrying hot meals. Tiny things. Until they weren't. One Tuesday morning, she received a call from the company's banking relationship manager. "I think you'll want to come in," he said. She assumed something was wrong. Instead, the meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. After reviewing years of financial statements, payment histories, reserve accounts, and corporate growth, the bank approved the company for an exclusive corporate black card. It wasn't offered often. The manager slid a presentation folder across the table. "This isn't a reward for spending," he said. "It's recognition that your company has demonstrated exceptional financial discipline." Monique smiled politely. Those words stayed with her much longer than the card itself. When she returned to the office, Ethan was waiting outside her office with 2 cups of coffee. "Good news?" She handed him the folder. He opened it, then looked back at her. "No way." She nodded. "We got it." He laughed out loud. "I knew we were close. We earned it." He looked at the matte black card resting inside its case. It feels different. It should. That afternoon, several department heads gathered in the conference room as Monique explained the new spending policies. She projected a simple document onto the screen: authorization limits, approval procedures, emergency exceptions, documentation requirements. One of the senior event managers raised a hand. With a card like this, do we really need all these extra rules? Monique smiled. Especially with a card like this. The room chuckled. She continued, access isn't what builds trust. She tapped the policy manual. This does. Most of the staff nodded. Ethan watched from the end of the table without interrupting. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Monique locked the black card inside the office safe before closing the steel door. Ethan leaned against the frame of her office. You know, he said, most people would celebrate getting something like that. I am. He looked around the quiet office. It doesn't look like it. She smiled. The celebration was everything we did before today. He laughed softly. Only you would say something like that. She turned the dial on the safe. This card isn't proof we've made it. He tilted his head. It's proof people trust us not to forget where we started. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan nodded. I won't forget. She believed him. Over the next 2 years, Atlanta's charitable world changed. Fundraising became bigger. Galas became more extravagant. Luxury brands wanted their names attached to nonprofit events. Corporate sponsors expected experiences instead of dinners. The guest lists became wealthier. The venues became more exclusive. Some nights, it felt less like charity and more like high society, wearing philanthropy as formal attire. Ethan adapted naturally. He could move from a conversation about pediatric healthcare funding to discussing art collections, vacation homes, or investment trends without making anyone feel uncomfortable. People enjoyed being around him. Doors continued opening. Monique noticed something else. Budgets were getting tighter even as events became more expensive. A donor would promise funding before paperwork was finalized. A luxury feature would be approved because another sponsor was almost confirmed. An additional expense would appear with the explanation, "We'll cover it after next week's meeting." The first few times, she adjusted the numbers herself. The company had healthy reserves. There was room, but patterns mattered more than individual decisions. One Friday afternoon, she stepped into Ethan's office carrying 3 financial reports. He looked up from his laptop. Tell me that's good news. It depends. He smiled. I don't love that answer. She placed the reports on his desk. We've approved nearly $300,000 in commitments tied to donations that haven't been signed yet. They will be. They probably will. He leaned back. So what's the problem? The word, probably. He rubbed the back of his neck. You always worry before everyone else. And? And you're usually right. She waited. He smiled again. But you've also always figured out how to keep us on track. It sounded like confidence. It even sounded like a compliment. Still, something about the sentence lingered after she left his office. Not because he'd expected her to solve the problem, because he'd said it as though solving every problem had quietly become her responsibility. She stood outside the conference room for a moment, watching employees prepare for another successful fundraiser. Everyone looked busy. Everything looked normal. She opened one of the reports again. The numbers still balanced. The company was still healthy. No crisis had arrived. But for the first time in years, she found herself wondering whether they were beginning to rely on her ability to repair mistakes instead of preventing them. She closed the folder and walked back toward her office. There was another gala to organize, another charity counting on them, another promise to keep. She had no idea that, within a few weeks, the same black card she had locked away as a symbol of trust would become the clearest proof of how far Ethan had drifted from the life they had built together. By the time Vanessa Brooks became part of Ethan's world, the marriage wasn't loud enough to attract attention. It had become efficient. Most evenings, Ethan and Monique still drove home together after events. They still discussed vendor schedules over dinner, compared calendars for the week ahead, and reminded each other about board meetings or client calls. From the outside, they looked like a couple who had simply settled into a comfortable routine. Only they knew how much of that routine had become work. One Thursday evening, they attended a fundraising reception at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. It wasn't one of their events. They were guests, for once, invited by a children's literacy foundation looking for planning partners for the following year. The gardens were filled with soft music, white tablecloths, and people who had mastered the art of making conversations sound effortless. Monique was speaking with the foundation's executive director about volunteer coordination when she noticed Ethan across the courtyard. He was laughing, not unusually. He laughed with people all the time. What caught her attention was something smaller. He wasn't checking to see where she was. He used to. At crowded events, he'd glance across the room every so often, almost without thinking. If someone introduced him to an important donor, he'd wave Monique over. "You need to meet my wife," he'd say. Or, "She's the one who actually knows how this company runs." Tonight, he never looked her way. The thought came and went so quickly she almost dismissed it. Instead, she turned back to her conversation. The foundation director smiled. "We've heard wonderful things about your company." "Thank you. And your husband is impossible not to like." Monique laughed. "That sounds like Ethan. You two make a great team." "We've been lucky." The woman nodded before someone else called her away. Monique watched her disappear into another conversation. Lucky. She still believed that. She wanted to. Later that evening, Ethan introduced her to several guests she hadn't met before. "This is Monique." He smiled warmly. "She runs operations." Everyone shook her hand. The conversations moved on. No one realized anything had changed, not because Ethan had said something wrong, because he'd left something out. Monique didn't react. There wasn't anything to react to. Still, as she accepted another glass of sparkling water from a passing server, she found herself replaying the introduction. "This is Monique, not, 'This is my wife.'" The difference was only a few words. Somehow, it occupied much more space than that. A few weeks later, another charity event brought Ethan into the orbit of Vanessa Brooks. Vanessa wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't trying to be. She came from a well-known Atlanta family whose foundation supported education, housing, and arts programs across the city. She served on several nonprofit boards, chaired fundraising committees, and somehow remembered almost everyone's name after meeting them once. People trusted her. She had earned that trust over years of showing up. The first conversation between her and Ethan lasted less than 10 minutes. They disagreed about auction formats. She thought silent auctions encouraged thoughtful giving. Ethan argued that live auctions inspired larger donations through shared energy. They laughed about it. Someone introduced them again at another event, then another. Eventually, conversations became familiar instead of formal. Monique noticed Vanessa the same way she noticed most regular faces in Atlanta's nonprofit community. Professional, prepared, always early, never demanding attention. There was nothing about Vanessa that made Monique uncomfortable. If anything, she appreciated working with someone who respected schedules and actually answered emails. The first real shift happened during a planning dinner several months later. The restaurant had mostly emptied by the time dessert arrived. Board members filtered out one by one until only a handful of people remained. Monique excused herself to take a call from a venue manager dealing with a delivery issue. By the time she returned, Ethan and Vanessa were still talking. She didn't think much of it, until she walked close enough to hear Ethan say, "It's complicated." Vanessa looked sympathetic. "I didn't mean to pry." "You didn't." He smiled faintly. "It's just, people see us working together and assume everything at home looks the same." Monique stopped for a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone to notice. Then she continued walking toward the table. Ethan looked up immediately. "There you are." The venue confirmed the revised loading schedule. "Perfect." He pushed her chair back for her. The conversation moved somewhere else. Monique never asked what "it's complicated" meant. She wasn't even sure she'd heard enough to ask. Weeks passed, then months. Without realizing it, Ethan began sharing carefully edited pieces of his life whenever he and Vanessa crossed paths. He spoke about long workdays, separate schedules, conversations that never seemed to happen anymore. He described emotional distance. He never described how it had grown. He never mentioned the promises Monique still kept every day without being asked. He never mentioned the years she had spent protecting both the company and the life they had built together. Most importantly, he never said he was still choosing that marriage. Vanessa filled in the blanks herself. She assumed they were two decent people who had stayed together because untangling a successful business would hurt employees, clients, and charitable work. She had seen marriages like that before. Polite, respectful, finished long before the paperwork arrived. Nothing Ethan said challenged that assumption. Nothing Monique did appeared to contradict it. Whenever Vanessa saw them together, they were discussing budgets, logistics, contracts, or donor seating. Professional, calm, efficient. She mistook emotional restraint for emotional absence. Meanwhile, Monique's attention had drifted somewhere entirely different. The quarterly financial reports sitting on her desk no longer looked the way they used to. Certain commitments were appearing before funding agreements had been finalized. Vendor deposits were increasing. Future donations were being listed with a confidence that made her uncomfortable. She carried the reports into Ethan's office. He looked up from his laptop. "Tell me you're bringing good news." "I wish I was." He motioned toward the chair. "What did we miss?" She placed the reports between them. "We're approving expenses before the money is guaranteed." He glanced at the numbers. "We've done that before. Not this often." He closed the folder. "The sponsors always come through." She didn't answer immediately. He noticed. "Monique, they usually come through." "They will." She studied him for a second, not arguing, simply waiting. He smiled, trying to lighten the moment. "You worry enough for both of us, and you assume I'll keep making that work." His smile faded for only a moment. "I meant that as a compliment." "I know." Neither of them said anything after that. She picked up the reports and walked back toward her office. Behind her, Ethan returned to his emails. In another part of the city, Vanessa believed she had met a lonely husband trying to hold together a marriage that had quietly ended. She had no idea the real story wasn't about a marriage running out of love. It was about one man slowly rewriting the truth until he believed it himself. The week before the annual Carter Foundation Charity Gala was always controlled chaos. The office stayed busy long after sunset. Floral samples covered conference tables. Seating charts changed almost hourly. Vendors called with last-minute questions. Staff moved from one meeting to another carrying garment bags, mock-up centerpieces, and folders thick with contracts. For Monique, it was familiar. She had lived through enough gala weeks to know that if everything looked calm on the outside, someone behind the scenes was working very hard to keep it that way. That Tuesday morning, she left the office early for a meeting with the board of a children's housing nonprofit. The presentation went well. The contracts were approved. By the time she reached the parking garage, she reached into her briefcase for one final document the board chairman needed before the end of the day. It wasn't there. She stopped, then remembered exactly where she'd left it, inside the conference room on the executive floor. She sighed, turned the car around, and drove back to the office. The receptionist looked up as Monique walked in. "I thought you were gone for the afternoon." "I forgot a contract." "Conference room?" "I hope so." She smiled and headed toward the executive hallway. The office felt unusually quiet. Most of the planning team was off-site inspecting the ballroom. Only a handful of people remained. As she approached the conference room, she heard laughter, not loud, comfortable, the kind shared between people who'd forgotten anyone else might walk by. She slowed without meaning to. The conference room door wasn't completely closed. Through the narrow opening, she could see Ethan standing beside the table. Vanessa sat across from him, reviewing a folder filled with gala notes. "I still think this designer is too expensive," Vanessa said. Ethan shook his head. "People notice details at events like this. They notice the cause. They notice both." She smiled. "You always win these arguments. Occupational hazard." They laughed again. Monique's hand remained on the folder she was carrying. She should have walked in. She should have announced herself. Instead, she waited, only for a second. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He placed something on the table between them. The matte black card. Vanessa looked at it, then back at him. I can't take your personal card. It isn't personal. He slid it closer. Use the company account. She hesitated. For flowers? For whatever the gala needs. She looked uncertain. What if it goes over budget? Ethan gave the same confident smile Monique had watched him give hundreds of clients over the years. Don't worry about the budget. Something inside Monique went perfectly still. Not because of the card. Not yet. Vanessa reached across the table. As she accepted it, Ethan's fingers lingered around hers for the briefest moment. Neither of them pulled away immediately. They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. They didn't say anything dramatic. They didn't have to. The silence between them already belonged to two people who believed they were alone. Monique understood everything before either of them spoke another word. Vanessa smiled softly. You trust me that much? I do. She lowered her eyes for a moment. I won't let you down. Neither of them noticed the woman standing outside the room. Monique didn't feel the rush of anger people often imagine comes with discovering an affair. She didn't feel the urge to storm inside. She didn't want answers. The answers were already sitting on the conference table. Instead, her eyes stayed on the black card. The same card she had locked inside the office safe. The same card she had spent years protecting through careful policies and financial discipline. The same card Ethan had once promised would never become a symbol of status. He wasn't simply handing Vanessa access to company funds. He was handing away something he no longer understood. For a fleeting moment, Monique wondered whether to interrupt them. She could have. One step, one push of the door, one sentence. Instead, she slowly stepped backward. The hallway carpet softened her footsteps. By the time she reached the elevator, her breathing had become steady again. The doors opened. She stepped inside alone. The mirrored walls reflected a woman who looked almost exactly the same as she had 20 minutes earlier. Only her eyes seemed different. When the elevator reached the lobby, the receptionist smiled. Did you find the contract? Monique paused. For half a second, she'd forgotten why she'd come back. Then she nodded. I'll print another copy. She walked past the front desk without another word. Outside, Atlanta moved exactly as it had that morning. Traffic crawled through downtown intersections. Construction crews shouted across the street. A food truck served lunch to office workers who had no idea someone's marriage had ended a few floors above them. Monique sat inside her car but didn't start the engine. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Meeting ran longer than expected. I'll see you at home tonight. She read it once, locked her phone, set it face down on the passenger seat. Then she started the car and drove away. She never mentioned what she'd seen. Not that afternoon, not that evening, not even when Ethan came home talking about gala preparations as though nothing had happened. For the first time in nearly 10 years of marriage, Monique realized there was a difference between keeping the peace and protecting a lie. The next morning, Monique arrived at the office before anyone else. She unlocked the front doors herself, turned on only the lights she needed, and carried a cup of coffee into her office that she barely touched. Her calendar was full. Vendor confirmations, a final logistics meeting, a conference call with hospital representatives. Nothing about the day suggested there was room for anything else. She completed every meeting, answered every email, approved every event schedule. If anyone noticed a difference, they didn't mention it. Around lunchtime, Ethan stopped by her office. You've got a minute? She looked up from her screen. Sure. He stepped inside, holding a folder. The catering team wants to increase the dessert budget. She reviewed the numbers. We don't need to. They're saying it'll leave a stronger impression. The children receiving the donations won't remember the desserts. He smiled. I knew you were going to say that. She signed the revised approval with the original budget restored and handed the folder back. Anything else? He hesitated. No. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say something. Instead, he thanked her and walked away. Monique watched the door close. He could still stand in her office for 5 minutes without realizing she knew. That hurt more than she expected. Not because he had hidden the affair well, because he had grown comfortable living two different versions of the same life. That evening, after most employees had gone home, she carried several archive boxes into the conference room. Inside were financial reports, board resolutions, vendor agreements, insurance files, and donation records dating back years. She wasn't searching for proof of the affair. She already had that. She was searching for something else. The truth about the company. She started with expense approvals, then sponsorship agreements, then payment authorizations. The first few files looked ordinary. Nothing unusual. Then patterns began to appear. A luxury venue reserved before donor funding had been finalized. Large deposits approved based on verbal commitments. Corporate hospitality expenses that exceeded internal policy limits. Each decision had eventually worked out. Each gamble had been rescued before becoming a disaster. She turned another page, then another. Every time a financial risk appeared, the documents ended the same way. A revised contract, an emergency sponsorship, a negotiated discount, an alternative vendor. Someone had always repaired the situation. She knew who. She had. Over and over again. Her phone vibrated. It was Olivia, the company's senior finance manager. "Still at the office?" Monique replied. "Yes." A minute later, Olivia knocked gently on the conference room door. "I saw your light." Monique smiled faintly. "Come in." Olivia looked around at the stacks of files. "Planning to sleep here?" "Not if I can help it." She pulled out a chair. "Need another set of eyes?" Monique considered saying no. Instead, she slid a folder across the table. "Compare these commitments with the funding dates." Olivia worked quietly for several minutes. Then she frowned. "These approvals came before the money was secured." "They did." "I thought our policy prohibited that." "It does." Olivia flipped through another file. "And these vendor increases." "They bypassed the normal review process." Olivia looked up. "Did someone authorize exceptions?" Monique held her gaze. "Yes." She didn't say Ethan's name. She didn't have to. Olivia understood enough not to ask another question. They worked until nearly midnight. By the time Olivia left, Monique had filled an entire legal pad with dates, transaction numbers, board approvals, and policy exceptions. None of it looked dramatic. There were no missing millions, no stolen accounts, no hidden offshore transfers. In some ways, the truth was more troubling. The company wasn't collapsing because of one catastrophic decision. It was being weakened by dozens of confident assumptions. Assumptions that tomorrow's donation would arrive, that next month's sponsorship would cover today's expense, that another successful gala would erase this month's unnecessary spending, and beneath every assumption was another one. "Monique will fix it." She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Not for long, only long enough to remember something Ethan had said months earlier. "You always figure it out." At the time she had heard gratitude. Now she heard dependence, not healthy dependence, the kind that slowly convinces someone the consequences no longer belong to them. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, she walked through the dark office toward the executive safe. She entered her code, opened the heavy steel door. The black card rested exactly where she had left it months earlier, after updating the spending policies. She looked at the empty slot beside it, where Ethan's authorized access documentation had once been stored. Her fingers rested on the edge of the safe for a moment. Then she closed it again. This had never been about one card, or one affair, or one afternoon outside a conference room. Those were symptoms. The deeper problem was harder to admit. Somewhere over the years, Ethan had stopped treating the company's safeguards as necessary, because he had started treating her as one. He believed she would always absorb the risk, always repair the damage, always protect him before anyone else noticed. Monique stood alone in the silent office. For nearly 10 years, she had thought saving Ethan meant saving the company. Now she understood those were no longer the same thing, and if she rescued him one more time, the people who would eventually pay the price would not be Ethan. It would be the employees who trusted their paychecks, the charities counting on promised funding, the families waiting for housing assistance, the children's hospitals planning programs around donations that had not yet been secured. She picked up her phone. scrolled through her contacts, then pressed one name. "Good evening," the attorney answered after the second ring. "I'm sorry it's late." "It's all right. Is everything okay?" Monique looked through the glass wall of the conference room at the empty office they had spent years building together. "No," she said calmly. "It isn't." She paused. "I think it's time we make sure everyone else is protected." When the call ended, she gathered the files into neat stacks, switched off the conference room lights, and walked out into the quiet Atlanta night. For the first time since discovering the affair, she wasn't thinking about confronting Ethan. She was thinking about what it would take to keep innocent people from paying for the choices he believed someone else would always clean up. Monique didn't confront Ethan. Not the next day. Not that weekend. Not even after another charity luncheon where he smiled for photographs while she stood beside a display board answering questions about logistics. From the outside, nothing changed. Inside, she had stopped making excuses for him. One evening, they sat across from each other in the kitchen, eating takeout because neither of them had been home long enough to cook. Ethan looked exhausted. "So," he said, opening a container of noodles, "after the gala, we should probably disappear for a few days." She looked up. "Disappear?" "A weekend somewhere." He shrugged. "We haven't taken a break in months." She held his gaze for a second. "A break from work?" "From everything." He sounded sincere. That was what made it difficult. He could still imagine repairing the distance between them without mentioning the reason it existed. Monique lowered her eyes to her plate. "We'll see how the gala goes." He nodded. "Fair enough." The conversation drifted to vendor schedules, transportation for guest speakers, and final seating adjustments. By bedtime, it sounded like any other evening in their marriage. Neither of them mentioned the conference room, or Vanessa, or the black card. The silence had become crowded. Monday morning brought another round of meetings. A hospital foundation wanted to increase its sponsorship. A housing nonprofit needed revised auction materials. One of the junior coordinators accidentally duplicated 200 guest badges. Monique solved each problem with the same calm focus she always had. By lunchtime, 3 different employees had thanked her for saving the day. She smiled every time. None of them knew she was trying to save something much larger than an event. Late that afternoon, Olivia knocked gently on her office door. "You have a minute?" "Of course." Olivia stepped inside, holding payroll reports. "I finished reviewing next month's projections." She placed the reports on the desk. "We're in good shape." Monique looked through the numbers. Every employee's salary had been accounted for. Health insurance payments, retirement contributions, overtime estimates for Gala week. She closed the folder. "Thank you." Olivia hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "You can. You've seemed distracted lately." Monique smiled politely. "Busy." "I know the difference." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Monique changed the subject. "Did accounting receive the revised donor confirmations?" Olivia understood immediately. She nodded once. "They came in this morning." The conversation ended there, not because Olivia wasn't willing to listen, because Monique wasn't ready to let anyone carry what she still considered her responsibility. That night, she drove to one of the charities the company had supported for years. A small after-school learning center sat inside a renovated church building on Atlanta's west side. Children were finishing homework around folding tables, while volunteers prepared sandwiches in the next room. The program director smiled when she saw Monique. "I wasn't expecting you. I was nearby." "You always say that." Monique laughed softly. "I know." They walked through classrooms decorated with handmade artwork and photographs from previous fundraising events. The director stopped beside one picture taken 3 years earlier. "You remember this gala?" Monique did. It had funded the center's reading program for almost 2 years. "We still have kids using books purchased because of that night." Monique looked around the room. One little girl sat in the corner, reading aloud to a volunteer. A teenage boy helped a younger student finish math homework. Nothing about the room looked extraordinary, until she remembered how easily it could disappear if funding ever failed. The director smiled. "Tell Ethan we're grateful." "I will." The words left her mouth automatically. Driving home afterward, She turned off the radio. Atlanta moved around her in the fading light. Restaurants filled for dinner. Office buildings emptied. Traffic slowed near every major intersection. Her phone buzzed through the car speakers. "Ethan," she answered. "Hey, you still at the office?" "No." "Everything okay?" "Yes. I was thinking—" He began. "After the gala, maybe we should finally start talking about expanding into Nashville." Monique tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Another city, more clients, bigger promises. She thought about the files spread across the conference room table, the policies he'd ignored, the risks he'd taken because he believed someone else would always catch him before he fell. "I think we have enough to manage here." He laughed lightly. "You always think smaller." "No." Her answer came before she could soften it. "I think farther." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Ethan cleared his throat. "We'll talk later." "Okay." The call ended. She continued driving. By the time she reached home, one truth had become impossible to avoid. For years, every difficult decision had begun with the same question. How do I protect Ethan? That question had guided contracts, negotiations, financial rescues, and countless conversations no one else ever knew happened. Tonight, another question quietly replaced it. Who am I protecting if I keep doing that? The answer wasn't immediate. It arrived piece by piece. The employees who trusted the company with their livelihoods, the nonprofit organizations scheduling programs around promised funding, the donors who believed every dollar would be handled responsibly, the families waiting for affordable housing, the children's hospitals planning next year's services. Protecting Ethan no longer protected them. For the first time since they built the company together, those two responsibilities had separated. She stood alone in the kitchen long after Ethan had gone upstairs. The house was still. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background. She picked up the framed photograph sitting beside the coffee maker. It showed the two of them in front of their first office, young, tired, holding a cardboard sign with the company's original logo because they couldn't afford permanent signage yet. She smiled despite herself. She still loved the man standing beside her in that picture. She wasn't sure he still existed. The next morning, she called the attorney again. "I've made my decision," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, only the calm certainty of someone who had finally stopped confusing loyalty with responsibility. "I'm not trying to punish my husband," she continued. "I'm trying to protect everyone who trusted the company we built." When the call ended, Monique opened her calendar. The gala was only days away. There was still enough time to save the organization. She simply couldn't save it the way she always had before. The next 4 days became the busiest week of Monique's career, not because of the gala, because she was preparing for what would come after it. She told almost no one. The fewer people involved, the better. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise. Every evening, she left long after the cleaning crew. To everyone else, it looked like another demanding gala season. Only Monique knew she was rebuilding the company's foundation while standing inside it. The first meeting happened in a law office overlooking downtown Atlanta. The firm's senior partner had represented the company since its second year in business. He greeted her with a concerned smile. "You sounded unusually serious on the phone." "I am." He closed the conference room door. "What do you need?" Monique slid several folders across the table. "I need every financial protection we originally established reviewed." He spent several minutes reading. The silence stretched. Finally, he removed his glasses. "These approval requirements were bypassed." "I know. Were the board informed?" "Not completely." He looked at her carefully. "Does Ethan know you're here?" She answered without hesitation. "No." He didn't ask another question. Some things didn't need explaining. Over the next 2 hours, they reviewed corporate bylaws, spending authority, banking authorizations, and fiduciary responsibilities. Nothing Monique requested was personal. Nothing violated company policy. In fact, she was restoring the policies the company had always operated under before exceptions slowly became routine. As she gathered her files, the attorney walked her to the elevator. "You've always been the cautious one," She gave a tired smile. I thought caution meant expecting the worst. It doesn't? It means protecting people before the worst happens. He nodded quietly. I think you're doing exactly that. The next stop was the bank. The relationship manager who had approved the corporate black card years earlier recognized her immediately. It's good to see you. You too. They sat inside a private office. Monique handed him updated corporate documentation. I need to restore the original authorization structure. He looked through the paperwork. This removes temporary spending flexibility. Yes. It also requires policy compliance before high-value transactions. That's how it was designed. He studied her face for a moment. Has something happened? She paused. Some decisions have moved outside the safeguards we created. He understood enough not to press further. Everything you've requested can be completed. How long? If we prioritize it. He checked his screen. Before the gala. She thanked him. As she stood to leave, he stopped her. When your company qualified for this account, I remember telling you something. She smiled faintly. You said the card recognized financial discipline. It still does. His expression softened. Don't let anyone convince you discipline is the problem. Those words stayed with her all afternoon. Back at the office, Ethan was in unusually good spirits. He walked into operations carrying 2 cups of coffee. I come bearing peace offerings. Several employees laughed. He handed 1 cup to Monique. For surviving Gala week. She accepted it. Thanks. You've barely looked up from your desk all day. I've had a lot to finish. So have I. He leaned against her doorway. Guess who confirmed attendance? She looked up. The governor? He grinned. Close. She waited. The CEO from Children's Healthcare Alliance. That's wonderful. It could lead to 3 new annual events. He was excited, genuinely excited. Watching him reminded her of the man she had married. The difference was that years ago, Ethan would have immediately asked whether operations had the capacity before celebrating new opportunities. Now he celebrated first. The logistics could be solved later, usually by someone else. He noticed her expression. What? Nothing. That wasn't a nothing face. She almost smiled. I was thinking about staffing. We'll make it work. She nodded. We always do. He kissed the top of her head before walking away. The gesture caught her off guard, not because it felt false, because it felt familiar. It reminded her that people could betray someone they still cared about. Life wasn't always clean enough to separate love from selfishness. The following day, Monique met privately with 2 members of the board's finance committee. She didn't discuss Ethan's affair. She didn't accuse anyone. Instead, she presented documentation, policy deviations, approval timelines, authorization inconsistencies. The committee chair reviewed the material carefully. Why bring this now? Because if we wait until after something goes wrong, we'll be explaining why we ignored warning signs. The second board member folded his hands. Can these safeguards be restored without disrupting the gala? Yes. And the charities? They'll receive every dollar they've been promised. The employees? Their salaries are protected. He looked relieved. What about donor confidence? Monique answered immediately. That depends on whether we solve the problem quietly or explain it publicly after it's become a crisis. The room fell silent. No one argued, not because the situation wasn't serious, because Monique had already anticipated every question. By Thursday evening, nearly every protective measure had been prepared. Payroll accounts had been separated from discretionary spending. Vendor payments for contracted services had been secured. Restricted charitable funds had been isolated from operating expenses. Emergency reserve access required proper approvals again. No headlines, no dramatic meetings, no confrontation, just careful work. Late that night, Olivia found Monique alone in the conference room, reviewing one last checklist. You still here? For a few more minutes. Olivia walked over. You know. She hesitated. I've worked here almost 6 years. Monique looked up. I know. I've never once worried about this company." Monique smiled. "I'm glad." Olivia shook her head. "No." She looked directly at her. "I mean because you're here." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Then Olivia picked up an empty coffee cup from the table. "Go home eventually." "I will." After Olivia left, Monique looked around the empty conference room. The same room where she had discovered Ethan handing the black card to Vanessa. Strangely, that memory no longer sat at the center of her thoughts. The paperwork spread across the table did. The employees, the charities, the promises, those had become her priority. Outside, Ethan was still planning the gala with complete confidence. He believed everything was ready. In one sense, he was right. He simply had no idea that the company surrounding him had quietly returned to the principles on which it had been built. And by the time he noticed, it would already be too late to rely on someone else to fix the consequences of his choices. The morning of the gala began the way it always did. Phones rang before 8. Delivery trucks lined up behind the hotel ballroom. Florists carried in towering arrangements wrapped in brown paper. Audio technicians tested microphones. Volunteers unfolded registration tables while caterers rolled racks of polished glassware through the service entrance. To everyone else, it looked like another successful event coming together. Monique made sure it stayed that way. She walked the ballroom once, checking place settings, emergency exits, stage lighting, auction displays, and accessibility routes. A volunteer stopped her near the entrance. "We're short 3 ushers. I already called in backups." "They're coming?" "They're parking now." The volunteer smiled with relief. "You always know." Monique smiled back. "I've simply been here long enough." She moved on before anyone noticed she hadn't answered the compliment. At 9:30, Ethan arrived. He looked energized in the way he always did before a major fundraiser. "There she is." He walked over carrying 2 coffees. "I figured you'd forget breakfast." "I already did." "I knew it." He handed her a cup. "You've been carrying this whole week." "We both have." He shook his head. "No." He looked around the ballroom with obvious pride. "Look at this. 10 years ago, we couldn't afford matching chairs." She followed his gaze. The ballroom was beautiful. It was also expensive, more expensive than it needed to be. "You did good," Ethan said. "We did." He smiled. "Right, we did." The words landed softly. Months earlier, they would have comforted her. Today, they sounded late. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "I've got to meet the television crew." She nodded. "I'll finish here." He leaned in and kissed her cheek before walking toward the stage. Several staff members watched him go. One coordinator smiled. "You two still look like newlyweds." Monique returned the smile. "We've known each other a long time." The coordinator laughed and hurried away. Monique stood alone for another moment before checking her watch. 1 hour. She left the ballroom through a side corridor and entered a private conference suite the hotel had reserved for executive meetings. Waiting inside were the company's attorney, the senior relationship manager from the bank, the chair of the finance committee, and one member of the board. No one looked nervous, only prepared. The attorney opened a folder. "We've reviewed everything one final time." Monique took her seat. "Any outstanding issues?" The board chair answered first. "Employee payroll is protected." The banker continued. "Restricted charitable funds remain untouched." The attorney added, "Vendor obligations required for tonight's event have already been secured." Monique looked from one face to another. "The charities. They'll receive every commitment the company has legally made." She nodded once. That answer mattered most. The banker slid one final document across the table. "This restores the original authorization structure exactly as it existed before the temporary overrides." Monique read the first page carefully, then the second. Nothing had been added. Nothing had been removed. The company was simply returning to the rules it had once lived by. She uncapped her pen. For a brief second, she looked through the conference room window toward the ballroom. Guests had begun arriving. She could see volunteers welcoming donors near the entrance. Somewhere out there, Ethan was greeting sponsors with the confidence that tonight would become another triumph. She signed the document. The attorney signed next. Then the board representative. The banker gathered the paperwork. It becomes effective immediately. Monique nodded. Thank you. There was no celebration, no dramatic announcement, only the quiet sound of folders closing. As everyone stood, the board chair paused beside her. I know this couldn't have been easy. She met his eyes. It wasn't supposed to be. You understand people may have questions tonight. They deserve honest answers. And Ethan? Monique looked toward the ballroom again. He deserves the same policies every employee has always been expected to follow. Nothing more, nothing less. The board chair gave a slow nod. I understand. Minutes later, Monique returned to the ballroom. The atmosphere had completely changed. Guests in evening attire filled the lobby. Reporters adjusted camera angles. Corporate sponsors greeted one another with practiced warmth. A string quartet rehearsed near the grand staircase. Everything looked exactly the way Atlanta expected it to look. Ethan spotted her almost immediately. There you are. He walked over, straightening his tuxedo jacket. I was beginning to think you'd disappeared. I had paperwork to finish. He laughed. Even tonight? Especially tonight. He smiled without asking another question. Ready? She looked around the room. Employees were in position. The charities they had promised to support were represented. Donors were checking in. Everything that truly mattered had been protected. Yes, she said. I'm ready. They entered the ballroom side by side. To everyone watching, they looked like the successful couple who had built one of Atlanta's most respected charitable event companies. No one could see that, exactly 1 hour earlier, Monique had made the single decision that would stop carrying Ethan's mistakes for him. She hadn't acted out of anger. She hadn't acted out of revenge. She had simply restored the promises they had once made to the people who trusted them. The consequences of that decision were already waiting inside the ballroom. No one knew it yet. Not Ethan, not Vanessa, not even the city's most influential donors. But before the evening was over, one ordinary payment terminal would reveal a truth that years of applause had managed to hide. The ballroom looked exactly the way Ethan had imagined it. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. A jazz trio played near the entrance, while photographers moved from one conversation to another, capturing smiles that would appear in newspapers the following morning. Hospital executives greeted corporate sponsors. Foundation directors embraced longtime donors. Volunteers escorted guests toward tables named after the children's programs and housing initiatives their generosity would support. Months of planning had become one evening, and for the first hour, everything worked. Ethan stood near the stage greeting nearly everyone who entered. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see you again. We're grateful for your support. He moved through the room with practiced confidence. Across the ballroom, Monique welcomed nonprofit leaders arriving from organizations the company had partnered with for years. She remembered names, asked about programs, introduced people who should have met long ago. Most conversations lasted less than a minute. Each person walked away feeling remembered. That had always been her gift. Near the entrance, Vanessa approached one of the luxury boutique displays arranged for the silent auction. The boutique owner smiled warmly. Mrs. Brooks, your additional centerpiece order is ready. Perfect. The woman handed her a receipt. We only need to process the remaining balance. Vanessa nodded. No problem. She reached into the small evening bag hanging from her shoulder. Without hesitation, she removed the matte black card Ethan had given her days earlier. The boutique owner accepted it politely. She inserted it into the payment terminal. Everyone continued talking. Nobody noticed. The machine processed for several seconds. Then, transaction declined. The owner frowned slightly. I'm sorry. Vanessa looked surprised. That's strange. She smiled politely. It must be the machine. It happens. The owner pressed a few buttons. Let's try again. Vanessa nodded. Please. The card disappeared into the terminal a second time. Another pause. Another message. Transaction declined. This time, Vanessa's smile faltered. She looked down at the card as though she had picked up the wrong one. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "There must be some mistake." Not far away, Ethan noticed the delay. He excused himself from a conversation with 2 corporate sponsors and walked over. "Everything okay?" Vanessa looked relieved to see him. "The payment won't go through." He laughed lightly. "It's probably the network." She handed him the card. "I thought so too." Ethan accepted it without concern. He turned toward the boutique owner. "Let's see." The woman reset the machine again. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "No worries." Ethan inserted the card himself. He folded his arms while the terminal processed the payment. He had never seen the card declined before, not once, which was why he wasn't worried. The screen flashed. "Transaction declined. Contact issuer." Ethan stared at the display. For the first time that evening, he didn't know what to say. The boutique owner spoke carefully. "Would you like to use another form of payment?" He blinked. "There has to be a mistake." "I'm sure there is." She lowered her voice. "Sometimes banks flag unusual transactions." Ethan looked at the card, then at the terminal, then back again. "It worked this week." "I'm sure someone can clarify." Around them, conversations hadn't stopped. They had changed. People weren't looking directly. They were pretending not to notice, which meant almost everyone had noticed. A longtime donor standing several feet away leaned toward another guest. "I've never seen one of those declined." Neither had his friend. Across the room, a member of the finance committee caught sight of the scene. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked toward Monique. She was standing beside the director of a children's literacy nonprofit, listening as the woman described a new mobile reading program. Monique nodded thoughtfully. "How many schools are participating now?" 23. "That's wonderful. We're hoping to reach 30 before next year." "I think you will." She smiled warmly. "Please introduce me to your program manager before you leave tonight." Not once did she glance toward Ethan, not because she didn't know what was happening, because she already knew. The finance committee member watched her for another second before walking in Ethan's direction. "Ethan." Ethan looked up immediately. "I'm sorry," he said, forcing a smile. "Looks like we're having a technical issue." The board member didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked briefly at the payment terminal, then at the card. "Have you spoken with Monique?" Ethan frowned. "Why would I?" The question lingered longer than either man expected. Before the board member could respond, Ethan reached for his phone. "I'll call the bank." He stepped away from the growing crowd and dialed the relationship manager's direct number. Voicemail. He tried again. No answer. A third time. Still nothing. Vanessa stood beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "This isn't your fault." She lowered her voice. "Should I pay with my own card?" For a moment, Ethan almost said yes. Then he remembered how much the purchase cost. No. He slipped the black card back into his pocket. "Give me 5 minutes." As he turned, he saw 3 members of the board speaking quietly with one another. They stopped talking when he approached. One of them smiled politely, the kind of smile people wear when they don't yet understand what's happening, but suspect it matters. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not panic, confusion, because this wasn't behaving like a banking error. Banking errors didn't leave board members exchanging careful glances. They didn't cause long-time donors to whisper. And they certainly didn't happen on the single night when every important relationship the company had spent years building was gathered under one roof. Across the ballroom, Monique accepted another handshake. A volunteer asked where extra registration packets had been stored. She answered without hesitation. A hospital administrator thanked her for solving a seating issue before guests arrived. She smiled. "It's what we're here for." Watching her from a distance, Ethan felt an uneasy thought enter his mind. She looked exactly the way she always did during a crisis. Calm, prepared, completely unhurried. Except this time, she wasn't walking toward him. For nearly 15 minutes, Ethan managed to keep the situation contained. Or at least he thought he did. The boutique owner quietly set the purchase aside, assuring Vanessa there was no rush. Guests continued drifting toward the ballroom as the evening program approached. The music never stopped, but something subtle had changed. People who normally walked straight to Ethan now paused to speak with someone else first. Questions began moving through the room, not loudly, quietly enough that no one could later say gossip had started. What happened? Was there a banking issue? Is everything all right with the company? No one seemed to have an answer, except one person wasn't asking questions. Monique. She was standing beside a display featuring photographs from charities the company had supported over the past decade. An older gentleman approached her with an easy smile. Monique. She recognized him immediately. Richard Holloway, one of the earliest donors who had trusted the company when almost no one else had. It's good to see you, Richard. And you. He looked toward the ballroom entrance, where several board members had gathered. I've been trying to find Ethan. I'm sure he'll be here shortly. Richard nodded. I'm not worried. Then he smiled. I actually needed you. She tilted her head slightly. Me? The scholarship agreement. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a copy. You were the one who wrote the language protecting the endowment, weren't you? I drafted it with our legal team. I thought so. He tapped the document. That's one of the smartest agreements I've ever signed. Before she could respond, another donor joined them. Excuse me. He looked at Monique. I've always wanted to thank whoever insisted our donations be placed in restricted accounts. Richard laughed. You're talking to her. The man turned toward Monique. That was your policy? She nodded. It protects the charities. I've recommended that model to 3 other foundations. Monique smiled politely. I'm glad it's been useful. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Neither donor realized what was unfolding elsewhere in the ballroom. They simply wanted to thank the person whose work had protected causes they cared about. Across the room, Ethan finally reached the bank's relationship manager. This is Ethan Carter. I know. We've got a problem. I understand. My card keeps getting declined. There was a brief pause. No, Ethan. The manager's voice remained professional. The card is functioning exactly as authorized. Ethan frowned. I don't understand. Your previous spending authority was changed this afternoon. His stomach tightened. Changed by who? I'm not at liberty to discuss internal corporate authorizations. This is my company. Certain governing approvals were completed in accordance with your corporate documents. Ethan lowered his voice. Who approved them? Another pause. I think you should speak with Mrs. Carter. The line went silent. Ethan remained standing with the phone pressed against his ear long after the call had ended. He looked across the ballroom. Monique was speaking with 3 nonprofit directors who were smiling as they introduced her to someone new. No one looked surprised to see her answering questions. In fact, they seemed to expect it. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Ethan, it was Margaret Ellis, chair of the board's governance committee. We need a word. He forced a smile. Can it wait until after the keynote? I'm afraid not. She led him into a smaller reception room adjoining the ballroom. Inside were 2 other board members and the company's outside attorney. The atmosphere wasn't hostile. It was formal. Margaret motioned toward a chair. Please. Ethan remained standing. Can someone tell me what's happening? The attorney spoke first. This afternoon, several temporary financial exceptions were removed. Without my approval? They required board review under the company's original governance structure. I never authorized this. Margaret looked at him steadily. Actually, she opened a folder. The original structure required joint oversight for expenditures of this size. Ethan stared at the paperwork. I've been approving these expenses for years. Yes, and no one complained. The attorney answered calmly, because Mrs. Carter consistently resolved the financial exposure afterward. That sentence landed harder than Ethan expected. Margaret continued, We assumed the exceptions were temporary. They became routine. Another board member folded his hands. Ethan, you've done remarkable work building relationships. No one disputes that. But many of us didn't realize how many financial safeguards depended almost entirely on Monique. Silence settled over the room. Not accusatory, reflective, as if everyone was quietly revising memories they had never questioned before. Meanwhile, outside the reception room, the evening program continued. A representative from Children's Healthcare Alliance approached Monique. "I've been hoping to meet you." She smiled. "It's nice to finally meet in person." "I owe you an apology." She looked puzzled. "For what?" He laughed softly. "For assuming Ethan negotiated our partnership." Monique didn't answer. He continued. "I found out this afternoon you were the one who redesigned the reporting system that convinced our board to approve funding." She smiled modestly. "It was a team effort." He shook his head. "No. Our finance department specifically mentioned your work." Another executive stepped into the conversation. "And you're the reason our emergency grant reached the shelters during the winter storm, aren't you?" Monique looked surprised. "I only helped coordinate it." "You did much more than that." The executive smiled warmly. "We've wanted to thank you in person for years." Across the ballroom, Ethan stepped out of the reception room. He stopped walking, not because anyone was confronting him, because he could hear fragments of conversations he had somehow never listened to before. Monique suggested. She caught that issue. She negotiated. She built. She insisted. Every sentence sounded familiar, not because he had never heard those words, because he had stopped noticing how often they had been spoken. For years, he had believed he was the face of the company. Standing there now, he began to understand something far more uncomfortable. Faces attract attention, foundations carry weight, and everyone in that ballroom suddenly seemed to know which one Monique had always been. Ethan didn't go looking for Monique. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he would say if he found her. Instead, he wandered toward a quieter hallway behind the ballroom, where board members, trustees, and event staff often slipped away between speeches. He needed a minute. Or maybe he needed someone to tell him this had all become bigger than it really was. The hallway was nearly empty. Only the company's outside attorney stood near a window overlooking downtown Atlanta. He looked up as Ethan approached. "I was hoping to speak with you." Ethan gave a tired laugh. "I have a feeling everyone was." The attorney didn't smile. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Did Monique ask for this?" "She asked for the company to operate according to the policies the two of you originally created." "That's not what I meant." "I know." Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. "She could have embarrassed me." "She didn't. She could have walked into that ballroom and told everyone about." He couldn't finish the sentence. The attorney quietly finished it for him. "Your affair?" Ethan looked away. "Yes." "She never mentioned it." "To anyone?" "Not to me." The answer lingered, because it forced Ethan to see something he hadn't considered. Nothing happening tonight had been designed to expose his marriage. Everything happening tonight had been designed to protect the organization. The humiliation belonged to him because of decisions he had already made, not because Monique had created it. A familiar voice interrupted the silence. "Ethan." Margaret Ellis stepped into the hallway carrying a folder. "There you are." He straightened instinctively. "Margaret." She looked at him with the same calm professionalism she always had. "We've postponed tomorrow morning's governance meeting." "I appreciate that." "We'll meet Monday instead." He nodded, then asked the question he had been avoiding. "How bad is it?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "Worse than you think." He looked down. She continued, "Not financially." His head lifted. "Then what?" She sighed quietly. "For years, many of us assumed you and Monique divided responsibilities equally." "We did." "You used to." Her words weren't harsh. They were matter of fact. "Somewhere along the way, people stopped bringing financial questions to you." He frowned. "They did?" "They brought them to Monique." "Why?" Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "Because she always had the answer." Ethan didn't respond. She continued. "The contracts, the reserve policies, the emergency funding plans, the donor protections, The compliance procedures. Those weren't things we associated with Carter events. She paused. We associated them with Monique. He leaned against the wall. I didn't know. I believe you. That hurt more than criticism would have, because she wasn't accusing him of lying. She was telling him he had stopped paying attention. Margaret gently closed the folder she was carrying. Do you remember the housing initiative 3 winters ago? Ethan searched his memory. The emergency shelters? Yes. You accepted the public award. He nodded slowly. I remember. Do you know why the shelters stayed open? He answered automatically. Our fundraising exceeded expectations. She shook her head. No. The corporate sponsor withdrew 48 hours before the event. He stared at her. I didn't know that. Monique negotiated 3 smaller donors overnight, then personally rewrote the budget before breakfast. The event still succeeded. No one outside the office ever knew. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Another memory surfaced. The literacy campaign, the children's hospital expansion, the scholarship trust. One after another, moments he had celebrated publicly. He had never asked how many crises had quietly disappeared before reaching him. Not because he didn't care, because he had grown used to believing everything would somehow work out. He knew now why. Monique had always made sure it did. A round of applause echoed from inside the ballroom. The keynote program had begun. Margaret glanced toward the doors. You should probably be inside. He didn't move. Instead, he asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind all evening. When did she stop protecting me? Margaret looked at him for a long moment. I don't think she did. He frowned. What do you mean? I think she finally started protecting everyone else. Neither of them spoke after that. Margaret returned to the ballroom. Ethan remained in the hallway. The applause inside continued. It sounded distant. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the black card. Hours earlier, it had represented confidence, status, control. Now it felt surprisingly light, almost meaningless. He remembered the day Monique locked it inside the office safe years ago. She had smiled and said, "This card isn't proof we've made it. It's proof people trust us not to forget where we started." At the time, he had agreed without thinking. Tonight, he realized she had been talking about far more than money. He closed his hand around the card, then slowly slid it back into his pocket. When he finally walked into the ballroom, the keynote speaker had already begun. Monique was standing near the side of the stage with several nonprofit directors, listening as one of the children's charities thanked the company for nearly a decade of dependable partnership. One sentence caught Ethan's attention. The speaker smiled toward Monique and said, "There are people who make promises, and there are people who quietly make sure those promises reach children who will never know their names." The audience applauded. Monique lowered her head slightly, almost uncomfortable with the attention. Ethan didn't clap. He couldn't, because he suddenly remembered saying almost those exact words about her years earlier, back when success still belonged to both of them, somewhere between applause, magazine covers, and standing ovations. He had slowly stopped telling the truth about the woman standing only a few feet away. The room hadn't discovered something new that night. It had finally caught up with something that had been true all along. The gala ended the way successful charity galas usually do. Donors shook hands. Volunteers stacked chairs. Auction displays disappeared into storage cases. Staff compared fundraising totals while loading the last equipment carts onto waiting trucks. To anyone leaving the hotel, it had been another remarkable evening. Millions of dollars had been pledged. Programs had been funded. Children's hospitals, housing organizations, and education initiatives would all receive the support they had been promised. The mission had succeeded. Only a handful of people knew the company itself had barely avoided becoming something very different. It was close to midnight when Monique finally returned to the office. She wanted one last look at the financial reconciliation before going home. The building was almost empty. Only the security guard in the lobby looked up as she entered. "Long night." She smiled. "They usually are." He held the elevator for her. "Congratulations." "On what?" "The gala." She nodded politely. "Thank you." The elevator doors closed. She stood alone, listening to the quiet hum of the cables. For the first time in days, there wasn't another meeting waiting. No donor expecting a phone call. No emergency to solve. Only silence. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, she noticed a light glowing beneath Ethan's office door. He was still there. She wasn't surprised. She walked past her own office first, set her bag on the desk, then stood for a moment, looking through the glass wall toward the city. Atlanta looked peaceful from 20 floors up. It almost convinced her the night had been ordinary. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned. Ethan stood in the doorway. His tuxedo jacket was folded over one arm. His tie had been loosened hours ago. He looked more tired than she had seen him in years. "Do you have a minute?" She studied him for a second, then nodded. He stepped inside but didn't sit. Neither did she. For a while, the only sound came from the air conditioner cycling on. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I've been trying to figure out where to start." Monique waited. "I don't think there is a good place." "No, there isn't." He looked down at the floor before meeting her eyes again. "I know about the card. I assumed you did. I called the bank after." "Oh," he stopped. "I know why it happened." She didn't respond. "I also know it wasn't revenge." Another pause. "I don't think you wanted to embarrass me." Monique folded her arms loosely. "No, I didn't." His shoulders dropped slightly. "I keep thinking about everything people were saying tonight." He gave a short, tired laugh. "They weren't discovering anything. They were remembering things I'd stopped paying attention to." Monique remained silent. The silence made him continue. "I used to tell everyone the company worked because of you." "You did." "I meant it." "I know." His voice softened. "Somewhere along the way." He searched for the words. "I don't even know when it happened." "I stopped saying it." She looked at him steadily. "You stopped believing it first." The sentence settled between them. Ethan didn't argue, because he couldn't. He walked to the window overlooking the city. "I've replayed the last few years all night. I kept thinking I was becoming more confident." He smiled bitterly. "I didn't notice confidence had turned into assumption." Monique watched him quietly. "I assumed you'd fix things. I assumed you'd catch mistakes. I assumed—" "Oh," he stopped again. "You'd always be there." She answered gently. "I was—" He turned toward her. "I know. No." She shook her head. "Listen to what you said." He frowned. "You didn't say you appreciated me being there. You said you assumed I would be." The difference landed immediately. Ethan lowered his eyes. She continued, her voice calm, never rising. "That's where this started." He looked confused. "The affair?" She shook her head again. "No. This." She gestured lightly around the office. "Our marriage. Our company. Our life. It didn't begin the afternoon I saw you with Vanessa. It began much earlier." He didn't interrupt. "It began every time my work became something you expected instead of something you valued." She walked slowly toward the bookshelf, where framed photographs from early company events still stood. She picked up one of them. It showed both of them covered in dust while painting the walls of their first office. They were smiling so hard their faces looked tired. "You remember this day?" He nodded. "We couldn't afford contractors. So we painted until 2 in the morning." She smiled faintly. "You kept getting paint on the ceiling. You kept making me redo it. You were terrible." He almost smiled. Then the moment faded. She set the photograph back. "I never needed awards. I never needed magazine covers. I never cared that people recognized you before they recognized me. I cared that you remembered." He swallowed hard. "I thought I did." "You remembered what I did." She met his eyes. "You forgot what it cost." The room became quiet again. This time neither of them rushed to fill it. After a long moment, Ethan spoke. "I'm sorry. I know those words aren't enough. They aren't. I'm sorry for Vanessa. I'm sorry for lying. I'm sorry for making you carry everything." His voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry for letting people believe I built something that only existed because you never let it fall apart. Monique believed he meant every word. That made the conversation harder, not easier. She walked back to her desk and rested one hand on the chair. I've spent days thinking about what I would say if this moment ever came. He waited. I thought I'd be angry. I thought I'd want answers. I don't. She looked at him with a sadness that felt older than the last few weeks. Betrayal isn't always the moment someone chooses someone else. He held her gaze. Sometimes it begins when they stop noticing the person who's been choosing them every day. Neither of them moved. The office felt almost too quiet. Finally, Ethan spoke. Is there anything I can do? Monique took a slow breath before answering. I honestly don't know. The words hurt him. She could see it. But they were the only honest ones she had left. I hope one day you become the man I believed I married. She paused. I just don't know if I'll still be the woman waiting when that happens. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. There was nothing left to argue. No explanation that could undo years of slow neglect. No apology capable of rebuilding trust that had disappeared one unnoticed assumption at a time. When he finally walked toward the door, he stopped with his hand on the frame. I loved you. Monique looked at him quietly. I know. He waited. She didn't say it back, not because she wanted to punish him, because love had never been the question. Whether it had been protected was. Ethan nodded once, accepted the silence for what it was, and walked out. The office door closed softly behind him. Monique stood alone for several moments before turning off the lights. For the first time in nearly 10 years, she wasn't carrying the weight of fixing what someone else had broken. She was simply allowing the truth to stand where she used to stand instead. Monday morning felt strangely ordinary. The coffee machine still hummed. Employees hurried toward conference rooms with laptops tucked under their arms. Someone laughed near the reception desk. Another team argued, good-naturedly, about color palettes for an upcoming fundraiser. For a moment, it seemed impossible that anything significant had changed. Then the board meeting began. Every director attended. So did the company's outside attorney, the finance committee, and department managers whose work had steadily grown with the business over the years. Monique took her usual seat. She hadn't asked for anything. No promotion, no recognition, no public statement. She simply opened her notebook and waited for the meeting to begin. Ethan sat across the table. For the first time in years, he looked less interested in speaking than listening. Margaret Ellis called the meeting to order. We have several governance matters to address. The agenda moved efficiently. Financial safeguards were formally restored. Temporary authorization exceptions were permanently removed. Future high-value expenditures would once again require the oversight structure Monique had originally designed years earlier. No one objected. When the final resolution passed unanimously, Margaret closed the folder in front of her. There's one more item. She looked around the room. Our company has grown because different people contributed in different ways. She paused. It's time our leadership reflects that reality. The board voted to establish a formal co-leadership structure that acknowledged Monique's operational authority and fiduciary oversight as equal to the public-facing leadership Ethan had long represented. The decision wasn't presented as a reward. It was presented as a correction. After the meeting ended, employees gathered in small groups throughout the office. News spread quickly. Not because people enjoyed gossip, because many of them quietly smiled and said the same thing. It's about time. Olivia found Monique near the break room. She held 2 cups of coffee. I figured you'd forget again. Monique laughed. I've developed a reputation. You have. Olivia handed her a cup. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I started here, I thought the company was successful because Ethan could walk into any room and convince people. Monique listened. I stayed because every time something went wrong. Olivia smiled. You were already halfway through fixing it before the rest of us even knew there was a problem. Monique looked down at the coffee in her hands. I wasn't alone. I know. Olivia nodded. But you made everyone else better at their jobs. Before Monique could answer, several coordinators approached. One of them looked embarrassed. We've been talking. Monique smiled. That usually worries me. The room laughed softly. The coordinator continued. We wanted to thank you. For what? For never making us feel stupid when we made mistakes. Another employee added, you always explained things. You never made people afraid to ask questions. A third spoke up. And when my dad got sick last year, his voice caught briefly. You covered my projects without telling anyone. Monique hadn't expected any of it. She simply looked from one face to another. These were the people she had spent years trying to protect. Not because they owed her anything, because they trusted the company enough to build their lives around it. That afternoon, Richard Holloway arrived unannounced. The receptionist called upstairs. There's someone asking for you. Monique met him in the lobby. I hope I'm not interrupting. Never. He held out a small envelope. I've amended our foundation's partnership agreement. She looked surprised. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He smiled warmly. I also wanted future correspondence regarding our endowment sent directly to you. Monique looked at the envelope before accepting it. Thank you. Richard glanced toward the elevators. I've admired Ethan's ability to inspire people. He paused. But trust. He smiled gently. That's always had your signature on it. Across town, Vanessa Brooks sat alone inside a quiet cafe. The weekend's events had answered questions she hadn't known she should have been asking. She thought about every conversation she had shared with Ethan, every carefully chosen sentence, every unfinished explanation. She remembered telling a friend months earlier that Ethan seemed like a good man trapped inside a marriage that had already ended. Now she understood something painful. She hadn't been invited into the truth. She had been invited into a story edited carefully enough that she never realized entire chapters were missing. Later that afternoon, she requested a meeting with Monique. They met in a small conference room at the office. Neither woman seemed angry. Neither seemed comfortable. Vanessa spoke first. I don't expect forgiveness. Monique said nothing. I believed him. I know. Vanessa looked down. I kept telling myself I wasn't hurting anyone. Her voice became quieter. I should have asked harder questions. Monique answered honestly. Yes. Another silence settled between them. Vanessa reached into her handbag and placed the black card on the table. I should have returned this the day he gave it to me. Monique looked at it for a moment, then slid it back across the table. It doesn't belong to either of us. Vanessa understood immediately. She picked it up again. I'm sorry. Monique nodded once. So am I. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. When Vanessa left the building, she didn't look back. There were no accusations, no dramatic confrontation, only two women carrying different kinds of disappointment. By the end of the week, the company had settled into a quieter rhythm. Employees focused on upcoming projects. Donors continued renewing commitments. Charities received every dollar they had been promised. The organization had survived, not because someone had hidden the truth, because someone had chosen to protect people before protecting pride. And for the first time in years, the company's future no longer depended on one person silently absorbing everyone else's mistakes. 6 months later, Atlanta was preparing for another fundraising season. The company was busy again. Conference rooms filled with planning meetings. New clients signed contracts. Returning charities discussed next year's goals instead of last year's problems. Life had continued. It always did. One Monday morning, Monique unlocked her office before anyone else arrived. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor as she set her laptop on the desk and looked through the glass wall toward the city. The view hadn't changed. She had. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Olivia stepped inside. You're here early. I like the silence. Olivia smiled. I figured. She held up a folder. The Scholarship Foundation renewed for another 3 years. Monique accepted it. Any changes? They asked for one. What is it? Olivia smiled. They requested that you attend the signing. Monique laughed. I usually avoid those. I know. Olivia leaned against the doorway. They specifically asked for you. After Olivia left, Monique opened the folder. A handwritten note rested on top. Thank you for protecting what mattered most, even when no one knew you were doing it. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. She folded the note and slipped it into her desk drawer. Later that afternoon, she walked through the office. Nothing felt forced anymore. Department managers made decisions confidently. Junior coordinators solved problems without waiting for permission. The systems she had built years earlier were finally being used the way she had intended, not because she was carrying everyone, because everyone understood their responsibility. As she passed the reception area, 2 new employees were studying photographs displayed along the wall. One pointed toward an older picture of the company's first office. I can't believe they started there. The other smiled. I heard the woman in that picture built most of the operating systems we still use. Monique kept walking. They didn't realize she had heard them. She preferred it that way. Recognition no longer felt like something she had missed. It felt like something she no longer needed to chase. Near the end of the day, Margaret Ellis stopped by unexpectedly. I thought I'd find you here. You usually do. Margaret looked around the office. The board approved one more thing. Monique raised an eyebrow. I didn't ask for anything. I know. Margaret handed her a framed plaque. It wasn't elaborate. No polished speech accompanied it. Only a simple inscription. For honoring every promise long after the applause ended. Monique smiled. It's beautiful. Margaret looked at her for a moment. You know, people keep saying you saved the company. Monique shook her head. No, I protected it. There's a difference. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. There is. She left a few minutes later. The office grew quiet again as employees headed home. Monique walked into the conference room where, months earlier, she had stood outside the partially opened door and watched Ethan place the black card into Vanessa's hand. The room looked completely ordinary now. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Presentation screens had been updated. Someone had left a box of pastries from the morning meeting. Nothing remained of that afternoon except memory. She stood there for a while. Not because it still hurt the same way. Because she finally understood why it had hurt so much. It had never been about a piece of plastic, or even another woman. It had been the moment she realized she had slowly become invisible inside a life she had helped build. She wasn't invisible anymore, not because other people finally saw her, because she had stopped agreeing to disappear. As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed the framed photograph still sitting on the bookshelf, the one from their first office. The walls were unfinished. Their clothes were covered in paint. Ethan had his arm around her shoulders. Both of them were smiling at a future they couldn't yet see. She picked up the photograph. For the first time in months, she smiled without sadness. She didn't regret loving the man in that picture. She regretted staying silent after he slowly stopped becoming him. She placed the photograph back exactly where she had found it. Some memories deserve to stay. They simply didn't deserve to decide the future. Outside, the city lights began appearing one building at a time. Atlanta was full of people driving home, meeting loved ones for dinner, working late, making promises, keeping promises. Life moved forward without asking anyone if they were ready. Monique switched off the lights in her office and walked toward the elevator. The hallway behind her grew dark. Not empty, finished. Years earlier, she believed loyalty meant carrying more than her share because love required sacrifice. Now she understood something quieter. Love can ask you to give. It should never ask you to disappear. Ethan lost far more than a corporate black card that night. He lost the chance to keep building a future with the one person who had believed in him before anyone else did. Monique didn't win because he failed. She found peace because she finally stopped measuring her worth by how much of herself she could give away. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't walking away from someone they once loved. It's refusing to walk away from themselves ever again.